The morning sun glinted off the pristine waters of Lakewood Marina as David Washington cast his line into the calm lake. The silence was broken only by gentle lapping waves and distant bird calls. This wasn't just fishing, this was his moment of peace in a world that had never been particularly peaceful for a black man in suburbia. The tranquility shattered like glass when a white BMW screeched to a halt on the gravel behind him. "Excuse me, fishing is prohibited here." The voice belonged to Margaret Thornton, president of the Lakewood Hills Homeowners Association. Her perfectly styled blonde hair caught the morning light as she marched toward him, clipboard in hand, like a weapon of war. David didn't turn around immediately. He'd heard that tone before, sharp, entitled, carrying the unmistakable assumption that he didn't belong. The same tone that had followed him through corporate boardrooms, exclusive restaurants, and now, apparently, to a public fishing spot. "This is a public marina, ma'am," David replied calmly, his voice carrying the measured patience of someone who'd fought this battle countless times before. "I have every right to fish here." Margaret's laugh was cold as winter rain. Not anymore. The HOA just passed Emergency Resolution 152, no recreational fishing during peak hours. It's disruptive to property values. Those words hung in the air like poison gas. Peak hours, property values, code words that David recognized all too well. He finally turned around, his dark eyes meeting Margaret's pale blue ones. In that moment, something electric passed between them, the recognition of war being declared without mercy. "Interesting timing on this resolution," David said quietly, his jaw tightening. "Seems to coincide perfectly with my morning routine." Margaret's smile could have cut diamonds. "The resolution applies to everyone equally, Mr. Washington. Demox, racy, in action." But nothing about this felt democratic, nothing about the way she emphasized his name like it left a bitter taste. Nothing about how other residents had suddenly developed urgent business near the marina whenever he appeared with his fishing gear. "The fine is $800, Margaret announced, scribbling on her clipboard with theatrical flourish. "Payable immediately to maintain community standards." $800 for fishing in waters he had every legal right to access. David looked around the marina, at the empty boat slips that cost more per month than most people's salaries, at the exclusive clubhouse where no one who looked like him had ever been welcomed, at the pristine waters where his father had once taught him to cast a line decades ago. Margaret Thornton had just made the most expensive mistake of her privileged life. She had no idea who she was dealing with. The emergency HOA meeting that Thursday felt more like a public execution than a community gathering. David sat alone in the back row of the clubhouse, surrounded by 50 pairs of hostile eyes. The air conditioning hummed, but the atmosphere was suffocating with unspoken venom. Margaret commanded the room from behind a polished podium, her voice dripping with the authority of someone who'd never been told no. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're addressing the ongoing marina disruption." David's existence had become a disruption, as if his presence required crisis management. "Since implementing Resolution 152, we've had repeated violations from the same individual," Margaret continued, her gaze finding David like a predator spotting prey. "Clearly, stronger measures are required." Robert Sterling from Oakwood Drive raised his manicured hand. "Perhaps we need security patrols. The current penalties obviously aren't sufficient deterrent." David stood slowly. The room fell silent as if death itself had entered. "I'd like to address the board." Margaret's smile could have frozen hell. Of course, Mr. Washington, though only residents in good standing may speak at official meetings. My property taxes are current, David replied evenly. My HOA dues are paid. I'm in perfect standing. The silence stretched like a rubber band ready to snap. Finally, Margaret gestured toward the microphone with obvious reluctance. Keep it brief. David walked to the front, feeling the weight of 50 stares burning into his back. He stood at the microphone, looking out at faces that ranged from curious to openly hostile. I moved here because this neighborhood represented achievement, he began, his voice steady as steel. Success earned through hard work, but apparently none of that matters when someone wants to enjoy the same public waters that everyone else takes for granted. Some faces shifted uncomfortably, others remained stone cold. Resolution 152 wasn't about community standards, David continued, his voice growing stronger. It was about removing an unwanted presence from your perfect view. That's completely false, Margaret interjected, though her flushed cheeks suggested otherwise. This resolution protects everyone's investment. David smiled for the first time that evening, a smile that made several board members shift nervously in their seats. Then perhaps the board can explain these. He pulled out a folder and held up printed emails, internal HOA communications discussing the David problem, messages about maintaining community character and preserving the right kind of atmosphere. Language carefully coded but crystal clear in intent. The room erupted. Voices rose in protest, denial, outrage. Margaret banged her gavel repeatedly, but the damage was spreading like wildfire. "Where did you get private HOA communications?" Margaret demanded, her composure cracking like ice under pressure. "Public records request," David replied calmly. Amazing what becomes available when someone knows where to look. But the emails were just the beginning. Over the following weeks, David uncovered layers of systematic bias woven into Lakewood Hills' foundation. The security company had special instructions about monitoring certain residents. The landscaping contractor had been told to report unusual activities. The Marina management company received regular complaints about undesirable elements requiring attention. Each revelation felt like another stone added to an already crushing weight. This wasn't about fishing. This was about a coordinated campaign to make his life so miserable that he'd sell and disappear. But Margaret Thornton had fundamentally misjudged her opponent. David Washington hadn't built a multi-million-dollar consulting firm, survived military service in Afghanistan, and raised 2 children as a single father by backing down from bullies. Every challenge had forged him stronger. Every setback had taught him patience. Every victory had been earned through strategic thinking and relentless execution. While the HOA celebrated their legal victories, escalating fines, tightening restrictions, making his daily life progressively more difficult, David was making very different kinds of phone calls. The kind of calls that would change everything. The phone call that shattered Margaret's world came on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide her life into before and after. David's attorney had been digging into Lakewood Marina's ownership structure for weeks, following paper trails and corporate filings with the determination of a bloodhound. What he discovered was so shocking that he called David immediately, his voice trembling with disbelief. "David, the Marina, the entire complex, it's for sale, has been for 8 months. David set down his coffee, already sensing that everything was about to change. "Who owns it?" "That's the incredible part. It's owned by Thornton Marine Holdings, Margaret Thornton's family company." The revelation hit David like a physical blow. Margaret owned the Marina, The same marina she was using HOA ordinances to ban him from accessing. It gets worse, his attorney continued. The HOA management contract includes a clause giving Thornton Marine Holdings 15% of all fines and penalties collected. Every time they fine someone, she literally profits. The scope of the fraud was breathtaking. Margaret hadn't just been enforcing discriminatory rules, she'd been operating a criminal enterprise using racial bias as a revenue stream. "How much are they asking?" David asked, though his mind was already racing toward a solution that seemed almost too perfect to be real. $14 million for everything: marina, docks, clubhouse, all management contracts. David was silent for a long moment. Then he began to smile. Not the polite smile he wore for hostile HOA meetings, but something far more dangerous. "Set up the purchase through Shell.com.
Painies," he said quietly. "I want this transaction buried so deep they won't see it coming until it's too late." What Margaret Thornton didn't know was that David Washington wasn't just another homeowner she could intimidate. His consulting firm managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions. His military connections had introduced him to investors across multiple industries. His children's success in medicine and law had built relationships with influential professionals nationwide.
David could buy the marina without significantly impacting his financial position. More importantly, he now understood the true scope of the war being waged against him. The purchase negotiations took 2 months, conducted through layers of corporate structures designed to obscure the buyer's identity. While Margaret celebrated what she believed were escalating victories, new ordinances, increased fines, mounting pressure on the disruptive element, David was systematically acquiring the very foundation of her power. The final piece fell into place on a Friday afternoon when the sale documents were signed and filed. David Washington now owned Lakewood Marina, its management company, all dock facilities, and every contract that had given Margaret Thornton authority over the waters. But he wasn't finished. Margaret had spent months making his life miserable, profiting from her prejudice, weaponizing regulations to exclude him from community spaces. She was about to discover that some battles have consequences that last forever. The confrontation came without warning on a Saturday morning that would be remembered as the day everything changed. Margaret arrived at the marina for her usual inspection, clipboard in hand and righteous indignation fueling her stride. She was prepared to issue another fine to David, who stood at his familiar fishing spot despite weeks of escalating penalties. "Mr. Washington," she called out, her voice carrying across the water with theatrical authority. "This is your final warning. Security is on the way." David turned slowly, but something in his expression made Margaret hesitate. There was no resignation in his eyes, no defeat in his posture. Instead, he looked almost amused. "Actually, Margaret, I think you're the one who needs to leave." She laughed, a sound sharp as breaking glass. "I own this marina through family holdings. Your tree."
"It closed yesterday," David said quietly, "and effective immediately, I'm implementing new management policies." The colour drained completely from Margaret's cheeks as the full implications hit her. Her source of revenue, her weapon of exclusion, her foundation of power, all gone in a single transaction. "The marina is now permanently closed to HOA enforcement," David continued, his voice carrying the finality of a judge's gavel. "No more fines, no more restrictions, no more ordinances." Margaret stood frozen, watching her empire crumble in real time. "Security will escort you off the property now," David said, gesturing toward the approaching patrol car he'd already called. "You're no longer welcome here." 6 months later, Lakewood Marina had transformed into something Margaret Thornton could never have imagined. A thriving community space where families of all backgrounds came to fish, boat, and simply enjoy the water. David stood on the same dock where this battle had begun, watching his granddaughter cast her first line into waters that were now truly free. The no fishing signs were gone, replaced with safety guidelines and community event announcements. Margaret had moved away 3 months earlier, selling her mansion at a significant loss to escape the scandal that had engulfed her reputation. The new owners, a young black family, had immediately joined David's community fishing program. As the sun set over the marina, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, David reflected on the journey that had brought him here. What started as a simple desire to fish in peace had become something much larger, a testament to the power of patience, strategy, and refusing to back down from injustice. He cast his line one final time into waters that had once been forbidden. The marina was silent except for gentle lapping waves and distant laughter from families enjoying their newfound freedom. Justice, David had learned, was sometimes worth waiting for.